It happened right inside my bakery in front of 50 customers. My daughter-in-law walked toward me with a smile, then suddenly ripped the wig off my head, exposing the bald scalp chemotherapy had left behind. She held it up and laughed. "It's just hair, Mom. Stop making such a big deal out of it." My son stood less than 3 feet away, staring at the floor. In that moment, I realized I wasn't fighting to save my family anymore. I was preparing for war. This one starts quietly, but it builds. Before we begin, have you ever had to defend something you built when someone tried to take it from you? Just drop a quick comment, yes, no, or share your story in a few words. Your perspective matters here. Quick note, some details are fictionalized for storytelling, but the message is what stays with you. At 5:30 a.m. on a Tuesday in May, I unlocked the bakery door in the dark, my chemo-weakened hands trembling against the cold metal key. The lock clicked open the way it had for 38 years, but this morning the sound felt different. Final somehow. Like the last note of a song you've been humming your whole life. I'm Elaine Stone, 68 years old, owner of Main Street Bakery in Fairfield, Iowa, for nearly 4 decades. Stage 3, ovarian cancer diagnosed 14 months ago, currently between my 4th and 5th rounds of chemotherapy. The wig I wear is synthetic dark brown to match what my hair used to be, and it itches like hell in the humidity. I still come here every morning because this is where Harold lives. Not in memory, in the flour dust that never quite settles in the recipe card stained with his handwriting in the oven that he calibrated by touch alone. The doctors tell me I should rest. My son Desmond tells me I should rest. But resting means letting go, and I'm not ready for that. Not yet. Otis Fisher found me standing at the work table. 10 minutes later, my hands braced against the stainless steel, breathing through a wave of nausea. Otis is 52, my head baker for the past 20 years, the only person besides Harold who ever understood that bread making is equal parts science and prayer. He set down his coffee without a word tied on his apron and started pulling out mixing bowls. "You don't have to say it," he said quietly. "I can see it on your face. Bad week." "The oncologist is talking about hospice," I said. "Not today, not next week, but soon, maybe by fall." Otis's hands stilled on the bowl. "How soon is soon? 6 months? Maybe 8 if the next round works better than the last 4. He nodded slowly, then started measuring flour. That's what I've always loved about Otis. He doesn't do pity, he does presence. We worked side by side for the next 3 hours, shaping loaves and rolling croissants, not talking about death or time or any of the things that crowd into your head at 5:30 in the morning when your body is eating itself from the inside out. By the time we opened at 9, the display cases were full. Sourdough and rye cinnamon rolls and bear claws, the chocolate chip cookies that have been our signature since Harold perfected the recipe in 1987. Customers came and went, the same faces I've seen for decades, and not one of them knew that I was counting down my last summer in weeks instead of years. I'd made my decision 3 weeks earlier sitting in the oncologist's office while she drew diagrams of tumors and lymph nodes and other parts of my body that had turned traitor. The bakery would go to Desmond. My only child, 38 years old, a pharmaceutical sales rep who'd never shown much interest in the family business, but who deserved his inheritance. His wife, Raquel, 34, had been pushing for it for years. "Think of what we could do with the property, Mom," she'd say, her smile bright and sharp. "The location alone is worth a fortune." I'd always changed the subject. But dying puts things in perspective. Legacy matters. Family matters. And Desmond was my family, even if he'd chosen a wife I couldn't quite warm to. 2 days later, Thursday evening, I sat in their living room and made the announcement. Desmond and Raquel had invited me for dinner, a rare occurrence that should have tipped me off that something was shifting. Their 9-year-old daughter, Nell, sat cross-legged on the carpet, coloring in a sketchbook, her dark hair falling across her face. "I've decided to transfer the bakery," I said, setting down my water glass. "I met with Calvin Lancaster, my attorney. He's 63, been handling estate planning in Fairfield for 30 years. We're setting up a revocable living trust. When the time comes, everything goes to you, Desmond. The bakery, the equipment, the trademarked name, the lease, all of it. It's worth about $400,000 according to the most recent appraisal." Desmond blinked. "Mom, you don't have to." "I do," I said. "I'm not going to be here to run it much longer. Better to have plans in place now while I still can." Raquel's smile could have lit up the room. "Elaine, that's incredibly generous. We'll take such good care of it. Won't we, Desmond?" Desmond nodded, but he looked uncomfortable. He'd inherited his father's gentle nature, the kind of man who'd rather avoid conflict than win an argument. "We'll figure it out, Mom. You've still got time. The doctors could be wrong." "They're not wrong," I said quietly. Raquel reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Her nails were painted coral, perfectly manicured. "We're going to honor everything you and Harold built, I promise." I believed her. God help me, I believed her. I stood to leave a few minutes later, gathering my purse, hugging Nell goodbye. The little girl wrapped her arms around my waist and held on longer than usual, and I wondered if children could sense endings the way animals sense earthquakes. Behind me, I heard Raquel say something to Desmond in a low voice, her tone warm and satisfied. I didn't turn around. I didn't see the way her smile had changed, the way her eyes had gone cold and calculating the moment my back was turned. But Nell saw it. My granddaughter looked up from her sketchbook and watched her mother's face transform into something else entirely, something hungry and triumphant. I didn't see that look, but my granddaughter did, the smile of someone who'd just won. The moment Raquel's hand closed around my wig, I knew my son had married a monster. It was Mother's Day 2 weeks after that dinner, where I'd announced the bakery transfer. The party was Raquel's idea, thrown at the bakery itself, which should have been my first warning. She decorated the whole space with white string lights and pink roses, covered the tables with pastries and champagne flutes, invited what looked like 50 people or more. Most of them were her friends, women in their 30s with perfect hair and designer handbags, the kind who take pictures of their food before they eat it. I'd arrived at 2 in the afternoon wearing my best dress, navy blue with a modest neckline, and the wig I'd bought after my second round of chemo made my real hair fall out in clumps. The wig cost $300 synthetic, but convincing the same dark brown I'd had before cancer turned my scalp into a battlefield of scars and patches. Raquel stood near the counter holding a champagne glass, her smile bright as camera flash. "Everyone, can I have your attention?" she called out. The crowd quieted. Desmond stood beside her, looking vaguely uncomfortable in a button-down shirt he kept tugging at. Nell sat at a corner table, coloring in her sketchbook, her small body hunched over the page. "I just want to say a few words about my wonderful mother-in-law," Raquel began, her voice carrying across the room. "Elaine has been such an inspiration, so strong, so brave, fighting her illness with such grace." The crowd murmured approval. I smiled, uncomfortable with the attention, but willing to endure it for Desmond's sake. Then Raquel walked toward me, still smiling. "You know, Elaine, you're always so put together, always trying to look your best, but I think it's important to be real, don't you? Especially with family." Her hand moved faster than I could process. She grabbed the wig at the crown and pulled. It came off in one smooth motion, synthetic fibers sliding against my scarred scalp, and suddenly I was standing in front of 50 strangers with my head exposed, the patches of missing hair and chemo burns visible under the bakery's bright lights. Someone gasped. A few of Raquel's friends laughed, nervous and sharp. I stood frozen, my hands halfway to my head, trying to cover what had already been revealed. "It's just hair, Mom," Raquel said loudly, still holding the wig like a trophy. "Don't be so dramatic." I looked at Desmond. My son, the boy I'd carried for 9 months, nursed through midnight fevers, taught to ride a bike on the street outside this very bakery. He was staring at the floor, his jaw tight, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He didn't say a word. He didn't move. He just looked away. Then I felt small arms wrap around my waist. Nell had crossed the room without me noticing, her sketchbook abandoned on the table. She pressed her face against my side and whispered, "You're the most beautiful person here, Grandma." I held her back, my hands shaking, and thought, the only person protecting me today is a 9-year-old child. That says it all. I left 10 minutes later. Raquel tried to hand me the wig on my way out, her expression falsely apologetic, but I didn't take it. Let her keep it. Let her keep everything. That night at 2 in the morning, I sat alone in the bakery kitchen on Harold's old wooden stool, the one he'd used for 38 years, his back curved over recipe cards and mixing bowls. The lights were off. The ovens were cold. I held his photo in my hands, the one from our first year in business, both of us grinning in flour-dusted aprons, young and stupid and so damn hopeful. I cried, not because of the wig, not because 50 strangers had seen my ruined scalp. I cried because Desmond looked away. I kept thinking. I said to Harold's photo, my voice cracking in the dark. I raised him. I packed his lunches. I stayed up when he had fever, and tonight he looked away. How do you reconcile the boy who used to hold your hand with the man who watched you bleed and looked away? I don't know. I still don't. But I stood up eventually, washed my face in the prep sink with cold water, and left. No more tears. The next morning, I went back to the bakery at 5:30 a.m. as usual, but this time I didn't come to bake. I came to observe. 2 weeks later, in late May, I drove to Main Street and parked a block away from the bakery. I hadn't been inside since Mother's Day. I walked in as a customer, joining the morning line, keeping my head down. The first thing I noticed was the wall behind the register. Harold's founding photo was gone. The one where he stood in front of the brick oven on opening day 1985, his grin wide and proud. In its place hung a glossy studio portrait of Raquel in a pristine white chef's uniform, her arms crossed, her expression confident. The second thing I noticed was the menu. New fonts, new layout, new tagline at the bottom. Founded by Raquel Stone, reimagined for a new generation. Founded by Raquel Stone. I stared at those words until the counter girl asked if I was ready to order. She was young, early 20s, with a name tag pinned crookedly to her apron. Bridget Cooper, it read. "I'll take a cinnamon roll," I said quietly. "The signature one." "Oh, we updated the recipe," Bridget said brightly, her smile vacant rehearsed. "The new version is actually better." I paid in cash and walked outside. The roll was still warm in the paper bag. I sat on the bench across the street, the same bench where Harold used to take his smoke breaks before he quit in 1998, and unwrapped the pastry. The smell was wrong, too sweet, too much vanilla extract. I took a bite. It was no longer my husband's taste. The dough was softer, commercial, missing the slight tang of his signature starter. The cinnamon was different. The glaze was cloying. They'd erased him. Photo, menu, recipe, everything. Harold was gone. On my way back to this car, my phone buzzed. A text from Otis. "Ma'am, I need to talk to you about the boss's recipe book." I pulled over to the side of Main Street, staring at those 8 words. Harold's recipe book. I hadn't thought about it in years. I called Otis back immediately. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said. He gave me his address without asking questions. When Otis placed the brown leather notebook on his kitchen table that evening, I recognized Harold's handwriting before I even opened it. The cursive slant, the way he crossed his T's with a sharp upward flick, the ink bleeding slightly where he'd pressed too hard with his fountain pen. My hands shook as I reached for it. "The moment she started updating the menu, I took this," Otis said quietly. We sat across from each other at his small kitchen table, warm yellow light from an overhead fixture casting shadows across the worn wood. Steam rose from 2 mugs of tea he'd made without asking if I wanted any. Something told me it wasn't right. She doesn't know it exists. I opened the cover. The first page read, Harold Stone's Recipe Book, 1987 to 2022, Main Street Bakery, Fairfield, Iowa. Below that, in smaller letters, "If you're reading this and I'm gone, treat these right. Every word here cost me something." My throat closed. I turned the page. Cinnamon rolls. The recipe that had built our reputation, written out in Harold's careful hand measurements, precise down to the 1/4 teaspoon. But what made me stop breathing were the notes in the margins, dated entries spanning 35 years. "He wrote notes every year," I whispered, touching the ink. "Look, 1994, he reduced the cinnamon by a 1/4 teaspoon. 2003, he added orange zest. 2011, he switched to European butter." Otis nodded. "Every summer after the tourist season ended, Mr. Stone would spend a week refining one recipe. Just one. He'd test it 50 times until it was right. This book is the only record of all those changes." I flipped through slowly. Sourdough starter instructions updated yearly with ambient temperature notes and fermentation times. Chocolate chip cookies with a 2015 annotation. Nell's favorite, make them slightly underdone. She likes them soft. Rye bread with sketches in the margins, showing how to score the dough for maximum spring. 35 years of Harold's life condensed into one brown leather notebook that Raquel didn't know existed. "What do you want me to do, ma'am?" Otis asked. I looked up at him. 52 years old, 20 of them spent working beside my husband, learning not just recipes, but philosophy. Harold used to say that Otis had the best hands for bread he'd ever seen. Patient, gentle, willing to wait. "Keep it safe," I said, "and keep baking. Not for her, for Harold." That was the first time in weeks I felt like I wasn't completely alone. But I needed more than sentiment. I needed information. The next week in early June, I reached out to 3 employees who'd left the bakery in the months since I'd announced the transfer. Not officially fired, Raquel was too smart for that, but made so miserable they'd quit on their own. We met at a small coffee shop 2 blocks from Main Street, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and local art on the walls far enough from the bakery that no one would notice us together. I arrived, first ordered black coffee I didn't plan to drink, and waited. Margaret Hayes arrived at 10. 55 years old, she'd worked the morning shift for 15 years until Raquel made her life unbearable. She sat across from me with the tired dignity of someone who knew exactly what injustice looked like. She changed my schedule every week, Margaret said, stirring sugar into her coffee with slow, deliberate movements. I'd plan my whole life around Tuesday, Saturday mornings, then she'd switch me to nights with 2 days' notice. When I asked for consistency, she said I wasn't being flexible enough. Roger Quinn came in 10 minutes later. 48, he'd run the afternoon prep for a decade, his hands still bearing the calluses of a real baker. He didn't order anything, just sat down and started talking. She held my last paycheck for 3 weeks, he said. Said there was a paperwork issue. There wasn't. She was just making a point. Diane Brooks was the last to arrive. 35, the youngest of Harold's hires, trained personally by him in 2018. She sat with her jaw tight, clearly holding back anger. She called my decorating work amateurish in front of customers, Diane said. The same work your husband taught me, the same techniques I'd used for 5 years. I listened to all of it without interrupting. The petty cruelties, the systematic erasure of everyone who remembered Harold, the rewriting of history so complete that new employees like Bridget Cooper genuinely believed Raquel had founded the bakery. You have to understand that recipe book wasn't just paper and ink. It was Harold's voice. And these 3 people sitting across from me weren't just former employees. They were witnesses. Proof that what was happening wasn't normal business evolution. It was theft. Then Margaret leaned forward and said the thing that changed everything. She's been meeting with a franchise rep, Margaret said quietly. I saw the paperwork in her car when I went back to pick up my final check. They want to buy the brand name and turn it into a chain. Regional first, then national if it works. The coffee shop noise faded. I heard my own heartbeat slow and heavy. A franchise, I repeated. Corporate bakery, Roger confirmed. 38 years, Mrs. Stone. She wants to sell it to a corporation that doesn't know the first thing about baking. Pre-made dough shipped frozen from some warehouse. The Main Street bakery name slapped on storefronts in strip malls across Iowa. Diane's hands were fists on the table. She's erasing your husband so she can sell his legacy to people who'll turn it into another Panera. They left separately, quietly, the way people leave when they've delivered bad news and don't want to watch you process it. I sat in that coffee shop for 20 minutes after they were gone, staring at my cooled cup. The surface had formed a thin film, coffee going bitter and cold. They didn't just want my bakery. They wanted to erase 38 years just to sell the name to a corporation that doesn't know the first thing about baking. I didn't cry. I called my lawyer. I drove straight home and left a message with Calvin Lancaster's office. I need to see you as soon as possible, I said. It's about the bakery trust. I need to make some changes. Calvin called me back the next morning. We met 3 days later at his office on a Tuesday afternoon. Calvin Lancaster slid the ownership documents across his desk and said the 5 words that changed everything. The bakery is entirely yours. I stared at the papers. Deed of ownership, business registration, trademark certificates. Every single one had my name only. Elaine Marie Stone. Not Desmond, not Harold and Elaine jointly, just mine. When Harold died, the bakery transferred to you as sole proprietor, Calvin said. He sat back in his leather chair, wood paneling behind him, lined with decades of family files, the kind of modest law office that still smelled like old books and furniture polish. It was never marital property for Desmond, which means, legally, it was never marital property for Raquel either. The room felt very quiet. Outside, I could hear traffic on Main Street, the distant sound of someone laughing. Everything she's doing, I said slowly, changing the menu, replacing Harold's photo, negotiating with the franchise, all unauthorized, Calvin confirmed. She has 0 legal rights to that bakery. None. She's operating on assumption and your son's implicit permission, but legally she has no standing whatsoever. I thought about Raquel's studio portrait on the wall, the menu crediting her as founder, the altered recipes, the franchise deal, all of it built on a foundation that didn't exist. I want to establish a revocable living trust, I said. Everything goes to Otis Fisher. The brand name, the trademarked recipes, the equipment, the lease agreement. All of it. Not my son. Calvin's expression didn't change, but he set down his pen carefully. Elaine, that's a significant decision. Are you absolutely certain? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Desmond is your only child. Desmond looked away when his wife ripped my wig off in front of 50 people, I said quietly. He stood by while she erased his father from the business they built together. He's chosen her over me at every turn. I won't reward that. Calvin studied me for a long moment. Then he pulled out fresh paperwork and started writing. We spent the next 2 hours going over every detail. The trust would take effect immediately upon my signature, but remain private until the anniversary celebration in October. On that day at the event, Raquel was already planning I would make the announcement public. Until then, Raquel would continue thinking she'd won. The trust is irrevocable once executed. Calvin explained, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed the final draft. You can modify it at any time before your death, but once you pass, Otis Fisher becomes the sole owner of all bakery assets. Desmond gets nothing. Good, I said. I signed my name on the final page. The pen felt heavy in my hand, the ink dark and permanent against the white paper. It was June 17th, 4 months left until the anniversary. 2 weeks later, late June, I stopped by Desmond and Raquel's house to pick up some personal items I'd left in their guest bedroom during my worst treatment weeks. Comfortable clothes I'd worn when the nausea was too bad to drive home. Silk scarves I used when my scalp was too sensitive for the wig. A framed photo of Harold I liked to keep near me. Desmond wasn't home. Raquel answered the door wearing yoga pants and a tank top, her hair pulled back in a perfect ponytail. She didn't invite me in, just stood in the doorway with undisguised contempt. I'm just here for my things, I said, in the guest room. She stepped aside without a word. The guest bedroom was at the end of the hall, painted a pale blue, furnished with the kind of generic furniture you see in catalog spreads. I'd spent 3 nights here back in April when the chemo had left me too weak to be alone. Nell had sat with me reading her books quietly while I slept. My things were on the vanity, or rather in the trash can beside it. The wig I'd worn before Raquel ripped it off. 3 silk scarves, one of them a gift from Harold on our 30th anniversary. 2 soft cotton caps I'd worn to sleep when my scalp was covered in sores from the radiation. All of it crumpled in the small metal wastebasket like garbage. I stood there staring. Behind me I heard Raquel's footsteps. I threw those out, she said, her voice flat and matter-of-fact. You're spending money on things you don't need anymore. Where are you even going to wear them? I didn't turn around. I kept looking at the trash can, at the navy blue silk scarf Harold had given me, at the wig that cost $300. And honestly, Raquel continued, it wouldn't matter anyway. The cruelty of it was almost beautiful in its precision. Not just throwing away my things, not just the implication that I was dying too soon to need them, but the final twist of the knife. Even if you weren't dying, even if you had years left, you're too ugly for it to matter. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I bent down, retrieved the silk scarf from the trash, folded it carefully, and placed it in my purse. Then I walked out. Raquel didn't follow me, didn't apologize, didn't say another word. I drove home slowly, my hands steady on the wheel, my breathing even. But I didn't go inside when I arrived. I sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes, the engine off the afternoon heat building in the closed space. Not because I was crying, but because I was memorizing every single word she just said. The flat tone, the casual dismissal, the calculated cruelty, so I would never forget. Not when I was tempted to soften. Not when Desmond called asking why I'd changed the trust. Not when my conscience whispered that maybe I was being too harsh. I would remember this moment, her voice, her words, the wig in the trash, and I would never ever forgive it. 3 days after I found the wig in the trash, Desmond called. Mom, can we talk in person? His voice sounded strained, almost guilty. We agreed to meet behind the bakery the following morning. When my son asked me to talk privately behind the bakery, I thought just for one fragile moment that he was finally going to stand up. It was early July, the morning already hot and humid, the kind of Iowa summer day where the air feels thick enough to chew. The parking lot behind Main Street Bakery smelled like yeast and sugar from the morning bake sounds of mixers running inside the building, Otis's voice calling out instructions to the new staff Raquel had hired. Desmond stood beside his car, hands shoved in his pockets, the same nervous posture he'd had as a teenager when he knew he'd disappointed me. He was 38 years old, but looked younger, somehow boyish and uncertain. Thanks for meeting me, he said. I waited. Didn't make it easier for him. Mom, I know it's been hard. He started, his eyes somewhere over my shoulder, not meeting mine. The changes at the bakery, the way Raquel is running things, I know it's not what you and Dad built. Hope flickered in my chest, small and desperate. Maybe he'd finally seen it. Maybe he'd finally understood. But she's trying to grow the business, he continued, and the hope died as quickly as it had sparked. She has a vision, a real plan for expansion. The franchise opportunity could be huge. You have to trust the process. Trust the process. I stared at my son, the boy I'd carried for 9 months. The child I'd nursed through pneumonia at age 6, sitting up all night with a cool cloth on his forehead. The young man I'd helped move into his first apartment, the groom I'd danced with at his wedding while Harold took photos, and cried. "Did you see what she did with my wig?" I asked quietly. His jaw tightened. He looked at the ground, at the cracked asphalt, at anything but my face. Silence. "Desmond," I said. "Did you see it?" More silence. Then, barely audible, she said it was an accident. "An accident," I repeated. "She accidentally threw my wig in the trash. She accidentally told me I wouldn't need it anyway because I'm dying. That was an accident." He flinched but still didn't look up. "Mom, please, you're making this harder than it needs to be." "For who?" I asked. "Harder for who, Desmond?" He didn't answer. I nodded slowly, something cold and final settling in my chest. "Okay," I said. "I understand now." I turned and walked back to my car. He didn't follow me, didn't call my name, didn't say he was sorry or that he loved me or that he'd stand up to his wife. He just let me go, and I didn't look back. That was the moment I understood I was no longer fighting to win back my son. I was fighting to win back myself. You have to understand what it means when your own child chooses a stranger over the person who gave him life. It's not anger exactly. It's deeper than that. It's the severing of something fundamental, a cord you thought could never be cut. And once it's cut, you can't uncut it. You can't pretend the knife wasn't real. I drove home and sat in my kitchen for an hour staring at nothing, feeling the weight of complete aloneness settle over me like fog. Then a week later, in mid-July, Nell knocked on my door. She stood on my porch holding an old shoebox, the kind that had once held Harold's work boots, now reinforced with masking tape and covered in Nell's careful handwriting, "Grandma's Bakery Important." "Can I come in?" she asked. I made her lemonade. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Harold and I used to review the bakery's books every Sunday night, and she placed the shoebox between us. "I've been collecting things," Nell said. She was 9 years old, her dark hair in braids, wearing a t-shirt with a cartoon cat on it. "I hope that's okay." I opened the box. Inside were old photographs. Harold and me on opening day, both of us young and grinning flour on our cheeks. The bakery's 10th anniversary party, the whole neighborhood crowded inside. A photo of Otis teaching a baking class to local kids in 2015. Customer thank you cards, dozens of them spanning decades. A wedding invitation from a couple who'd met at our bakery in 1998, thanking us for being the backdrop to our love story. And underneath all of it, a handwritten list in Nell's careful cursive. Names and phone numbers. Mrs. Henderson from next door. Mr. Kim from the hardware store. The Jennings family who'd bought our bread every Saturday for 20 years. Margaret Roger and Diane, the employees Raquel had forced out. 37 names total. I asked Mrs. Henderson next door. Nell said quietly, watching my face. And Mr. Kim from the hardware store. They all want to help Grandma. My throat closed. I touched the list with shaking fingers. "They just don't know how," Nell continued. "So I thought, if you knew they wanted to help, maybe you could tell them what to do." I looked at my granddaughter. 9 years old, too young to understand corporate franchise deals, or revocable living trusts, or the legal mechanics of inheritance, but old enough to see injustice and do something about it. Old enough to know that when adults fail, children must step forward. "Why did you do this?" I whispered. "Because Grandpa Harold wouldn't want his bakery to disappear," Nell said simply, "and because you shouldn't have to fight alone." I held her then, wrapping my arms around her small frame, feeling her heartbeat against my chest. A 9-year-old child had just handed me a weapon more powerful than any lawyer could draft. Not money, not contracts, but community, memory. People who remembered Harold and loved what we'd built. I looked into that shoebox and saw my 38 years not lost, just waiting to be called by name. The photos, the cards, the neighbors who remembered. I knew exactly what I was going to do next. What I was going to do next required patience. I spent late July making quiet phone calls to the names on Nell's list. I didn't ask for anything, just listened, remembered together. In August, when I walked into the bakery and saw the new menu, Harold's name had been erased completely, as if 38 years had never existed. The menu was professionally printed, now glossy cardstock in sleek black frames. At the top, an elegant script, "Our Story." I read it standing in line, my heart beating slow and heavy. Main Street Bakery was founded by Raquel Stone with a vision to bring artisan baking to small-town Iowa. Using innovative techniques and premium ingredients, we've created a new standard for excellence in the heartland. Every item is crafted with passion and precision, reimagined for a new generation. Harold's name appeared nowhere. Not in the founding story, not in the recipe credits, not even in small print acknowledging the building's history. He had been erased as thoroughly as if he'd never existed. Raquel stood behind the counter helping a customer, her hair pulled back in a professional bun, wearing a custom chef's coat, with her initials embroidered on the chest. She was explaining something about European flour, her voice confident and smooth. "We've completely rebranded," she said to the customer. "This is a new chapter for the business evolved beyond the old ways." Then Dorothy Whitfield walked in. 67 years old, she'd been buying cinnamon rolls every Saturday morning for 23 years, and she knew exactly what Harold's recipe was supposed to taste like. She was a retired schoolteacher with steel gray hair and the kind of direct gaze that made liars uncomfortable. Dorothy looked at the menu, then at Raquel. "Whatever happened to Harold's original cinnamon roll recipe?" Dorothy asked. "The one with the orange zest." Raquel smiled, bright and dismissive. "Oh, we've evolved beyond that. The new recipe is actually much better, more consistent, more professional." Dorothy's eyes found mine across the bakery. I met her gaze and gently shook my head, placed one finger on my lips. "Not yet." She understood. She ordered plain coffee and left. I bought nothing. I walked out into August heat and called Calvin from my car. "The trademark is in your name," he confirmed. "She has no legal right to rebrand without your authorization." "The anniversary celebration is in 7 weeks," I said. "Let her keep the new menu until then." That Saturday night at 11 p.m., I used my key to unlock the bakery's back door. Otis and Nell were waiting in the alley, both dressed in dark clothes like we were planning a heist. In a way we were. We were stealing back what had been taken. Inside the bakery was dark and silent. The ovens cold, the smell of the day's baking still hanging in the air, vanilla and butter and yeast. I flipped on just one light behind the register, enough to see by, but not enough to attract attention from the street. Nell pulled the old photographs from her backpack. Harold and me on opening day, both of us impossibly young. The 10th anniversary party, Customer Appreciation Day in 2005. Photos Raquel had removed and hidden in storage. We hung them on the small corner wall behind the counter, the space Raquel had left empty. The photos looked perfect, arranged in a small grid chronicling decades. Nell pinned up customer thank you cards around the photos, dozens of them, their edges yellowed with age, handwritten messages spanning years. "Thank you for making our wedding cake. Best sourdough in Iowa. Harold, you made my daughter's birthday special." Then Nell pulled out a piece of cardboard she'd cut and decorated the edges carefully colored with markers, the letters drawn in her best cursive. 38 years of love baked into every recipe, she read aloud. "Is that right, Grandma?" My throat closed. "Perfect, baby. Absolutely perfect." She placed it in the center of the arrangement. Otis disappeared into the back office. When he returned, his hands were empty. "Harold's recipe book is in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet," he said quietly. "Behind the tax returns. Only someone who knows to look will find it. You have to understand what we did that night wasn't vandalism. It was restoration. We were putting back what had been stolen. We were making Harold visible again. We left at 11:30. When I looked back through the glass door, I saw Harold's photo on the wall under the yellow streetlight. He was still here. 2 weeks later, early September, I sat at my kitchen table with Otis and Nell. I had a notebook open, a guest list, and a plan. "We're hosting the 38th anniversary celebration in October," I said. "I want every person who remembers Harold there. Every longtime customer, every former employee, every neighbor who bought bread from us for decades." Otis leaned forward. "What do we tell Raquel?" "We tell her exactly what she wants to hear," I said. "That it's a family celebration, a chance to honor the bakery's history and future. She'll think it's her coronation day." Nell was taking notes in her sketchbook, her face serious. "I've made a list," I continued. 63 people so far. Margaret, Roger, Diane, Dorothy Whitfield, the Jennings family, Mr. Henderson and his wife, everyone on your list, Nell plus more. "What are you going to do?" Otis asked quietly. "At the celebration." I looked at him steadily. "I'm going to tell the truth, in front of everyone, about who built this bakery, about what Raquel has done, about who the real owner is going to be. And then I'm going to let 63 people who remember decide what happens next," I said. "I don't need FBI agents. I don't need lawsuits. I need 60 people who remember, and one October afternoon." Otis nodded slowly. Nell kept writing. The phone rang. All three of us looked at it. Raquel's name on the caller ID. I let it ring twice before I answered. "Hello," I said, injecting exhaustion into my voice. "Mom, I wanted to talk about the anniversary celebration," Raquel said, her tone falsely bright. "I have some ideas for how we could make it really special." "That sounds lovely," I said weakly. "I just want our whole family honored that day." She paused for a second, then, "Of course, Mom, of course." I could hear the smirk in her voice. She thought I didn't know what she was planning. That was her first mistake. In September, Raquel ordered a custom chef's uniform with her name embroidered in gold thread, the costume she planned to wear for her coronation. I know, because Nell told me. My 9-year-old granddaughter had become my secret intelligence network, moving through her parents' house like a ghost, watching and listening and remembering everything. She hired a photographer, Grandma, Nell whispered to me one afternoon at my kitchen table. And she ordered a banner. I saw the receipt. It has her name in huge letters. What does it say? I asked. Nell pulled out her phone. She'd taken a photo of the invoice, celebrating Raquel Stone Visionary Baker Future of Main Street Bakery. I stared at the screen. Visionary Baker. A woman who couldn't tell the difference between commercial yeast and sourdough starter. A woman who'd never baked anything in her life before marrying into mine. There's more, Nell said quietly. She swiped to another photo, an email left open on Desmond's laptop while he'd gone to get coffee. From Raquel to someone named Derek Hoffman at Heartland Franchise Group. The subject line read, Timeline Update. The body was 3 sentences. Transition will be official next month at the anniversary celebration. All stakeholders aligned. We'll be ready to move forward immediately after. I read it twice. Then I closed my eyes and breathed. Does Dad know? I asked. Nell looked at the table. He was sitting right next to her when she wrote it. Of course he was. I called Calvin that afternoon. Is the trust ready? Signed, sealed, filed, he confirmed. Otis Fisher is the sole beneficiary. The moment you make the announcement, it's legally binding. I want you to serve notice to Otis on the day of the anniversary, I said. No sooner, no later. Official documentation that he's the legal owner. You're sure about the timing? I'm sure, I said. She needs an audience for this, so do I. She was preparing for a coronation. I was preparing for a reckoning. Before I tell you how's everything changed in those final weeks, are you still with me? Comment. A, if you think small-town justice can work, or B, if she'll escape anyway. Add one short reason so I can see how you're reading this. Please note some details ahead are recreated for narrative impact, though the lesson is what matters. 2 weeks before the anniversary in late September, something happened that I didn't plan, something I couldn't have orchestrated if I'd tried. The video started circulating, not the video of the anniversary that hadn't happened yet. The video from Mother's Day, the one where Raquel ripped my wig off in front of 50 people. Apparently someone at the party had recorded it on their phone and sent it around. I don't know if it was intentional or just the reflex of someone who couldn't believe what they were seeing. But Fairfield, Iowa has a population of 9,000 people. You have to understand, in a town of 9,000 people, a video like that doesn't go viral. It goes nuclear. My phone started ringing on a Tuesday morning. Dorothy Whitfield called first. Elaine! She said, her voice shaking with rage. I just saw that video. What that woman did to you. I'm coming to that anniversary even if I have to crawl there. You don't have to. I'm coming, she repeated. And I'm bringing my husband and my sister and anyone else who'll listen. Margaret Hayes texted me an hour later. We all saw it. Every single person you invited. We're all coming. Roger Quinn called. Diane Brooks called. The Jennings family called. Mr. Henderson from next door knocked on my door in person, so angry he could barely speak. That's not right, he kept saying. That's not right, Elaine. That woman has to answer for this. By the end of the week, my RSVP count had grown from 60 to 73 people. Raquel had no idea. She thought people were coming to celebrate her. She thought the turnout was because word had spread about the big announcement about the exciting new direction for the bakery. She spent the final week before the anniversary preparing, getting her hair done, practicing her speech in front of Desmond, making sure the photographer knew which angles made her look best. I spent the final week confirming with Calvin, reviewing the trust documents one more time, and calling Otis to make sure he understood what was about to happen. You're giving me the bakery, he said quietly, in front of everyone. I'm giving you what you've earned, I corrected. Harold would have wanted it this way. You know that. His voice cracked. Yes, ma'am, I know that. Nell came over the night before the anniversary. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Harold and I used to plan the week's menu, and asked me a question. Grandma, what's going to happen tomorrow? I looked at her, 9 years old enough to see injustice, old enough to fight back, old enough to deserve the truth. Tomorrow, I said carefully. 73 people who remember your grandfather are going to hear the truth about what's been happening to his bakery. And then they're going to decide what kind of town Fairfield is. Whether we're the kind of people who let bullies win, or whether we're the kind of people who remember. What do you think they'll decide? She asked. I smiled. I think your grandfather didn't spend 38 years baking bread for this town without learning who they really are. I think he knew exactly who he was feeding, and I think they remember. 73 people. Raquel thought they were coming to celebrate her. She thought she'd ordered a custom chef's uniform for her moment of triumph. She thought the professional photographer was there to document her coronation. She had no idea. By the day of the anniversary, more people had said yes than I'd ever expected. My daughter-in-law thought it was the day of her coronation. She thought she'd ordered a banner with her name in gold letters for a celebration. In reality, it was Judgment Day. Judgment Day started at 4 in the morning in the dark with flour and butter and Harold's handwriting. At 4 in the morning on the day of the 38th anniversary, I unlocked the bakery and walked into the kitchen where Harold and I had started with $800 and a dream. Otis was already there waiting by the back door, Harold's brown leather recipe book in his hands. We didn't talk about what was going to happen in 6 hours. We didn't talk about the 73 people who would be arriving. We didn't talk about Raquel or the franchise deal or the trust documents Calvin would be serving. We just baked. I opened Harold's recipe book to the first page. Cinnamon rolls. The original recipe from 1987 before any of the yearly refinements before the orange zest in 2003 or the European butter switch in 2011. The foundational recipe. The one that had built everything. Otis measured flour while I softened butter. The kitchen was dark except for the work lights over the prep table, the rest of Fairfield still sleeping Main Street, empty and quiet outside the windows. Otis had brought his old radio, the same one he'd used for 20 years of morning shifts, and turned it to the country music station Harold used to love. Soft guitar and steady drums, the kind of music that doesn't demand attention, just keeps you company. We mixed dough, kneaded, let it rise in the warming drawer while we started the peach cobbler. Another Harold original, the one he'd developed for the farmer's market in 1993, using Iowa peaches and a crust so flaky it shattered when you bit into it. The sourdough came next. The starter was one Otis had kept alive secretly for months, fed and maintained in his own kitchen, descended from the original starter Harold had cultivated in 1985. 38 years of continuous fermentation passed down like an inheritance. We worked in silence. The only sounds were the hum of the oven, the soft scrape of dough cutters on steel, the quiet voice of a country singer on the radio singing about going home. For 2 hours in that dark kitchen before sunrise, it was just me and Otis and Harold's recipes, and for the first time since he died, I felt him there. Not as a memory, not as a photograph on the wall, but as a presence woven into the muscle memory of measuring and mixing the way my hands knew exactly how the dough should feel, the way I could tell by smell alone when the oven temperature was right. At 6 in the morning, the sun started to rise. Light came through the bakery windows, golden and soft, touching the display cases and the corner wall where we'd hung Harold's photos. The ovens were full. The first batch of cinnamon rolls had just come out, their tops glazed and perfect, the exact color of caramelized honey. Otis stood at the window looking out at Main Street as it slowly brightened. Then he turned and said very quietly, "It smells like it used to." I looked around the kitchen, at the cooling racks full of pastries made from Harold's exact recipes, at the sourdough loaves proving in their baskets, at the peach cobbler cooling on the counter, its crust golden and cracked in all the right places. "It always should have," I said. We kept baking. By 8:30, the bakery was full of the exact aroma that had greeted customers for 38 years. Cinnamon and yeast and butter and peaches, the smell of home, the smell of Harold. Raquel would arrive in less than an hour, and she would walk into a bakery that had been reclaimed while she slept. At 9 o'clock, 30 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, I was arranging pastries on serving platters when Raquel appeared in the back hallway. She grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the prep area, her grip tight enough to hurt. "I need you to sign something," she said. She pulled a thick envelope from her designer handbag and thrust it into my hands. I opened it. Inside was a formal buyout offer printed on expensive letterhead from Heartland Franchise Group. I read slowly. The offer valued the bakery at $240,000, 40% below the actual appraised value. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was Clause 7 buried on page 3. Seller agrees not to reference personal involvement in business operations or founding narrative in any future marketing, public communications, or media appearances. I read it twice to make sure I understood. They wanted to buy Harold's Bakery for less than it was worth, and they wanted me to agree in writing never to mention that I'd been part of it. Never to tell anyone that Harold and I had built it. Never to claim any connection to the 38 years we'd given to this place. They wanted to erase me legally, permanently, completely. "This is the best offer you'll get, Mom," Raquel said, her voice honey-sweet. "You're not well. You don't have much time left. Let us take it from here. Let us handle the business. You can rest. I looked at her. Really looked at her. 34 years old, wearing designer jeans and a silk blouse, her hair professionally styled, her nails perfect. A woman who had never built anything in her life. A woman who thought legacy was something you could buy and rebrand and sell to the highest bidder. I folded the envelope carefully, slipped it into my apron pocket, turned back toward the preparation area without saying a word. "Mom," Raquel called after me, "I need an answer." I didn't tell her that she would get her answer in less than 30 minutes. I didn't tell her that I would be reading that clause out loud to 73 people who had known me and Harold for decades. I didn't tell her that the envelope she'd just handed me was the final piece of evidence I needed. I just walked away. At 9:15, Raquel walked through the front door wearing her custom chef's uniform, with her name embroidered in gold thread across the chest. The photographer she'd hired was setting up his equipment. The banner she'd ordered, celebrating Raquel Stone, visionary baker, future of Main Street Bakery, was already hanging above the counter. She smiled at me across the bakery, confident and bright. She had no idea. By 9:30, 73 people had filled the bakery and spilled into the courtyard. Raquel stood near the podium in her gold-embroidered uniform, smiling. I stood in the back, my apron still dusted with flour. The first person to stand was Dorothy Whitfield, and when she said, "March 2011, my husband's funeral," Elaine made all the food and refused payment. I knew this wasn't going to be a ceremony. It was going to be a reckoning. Dorothy's voice carried across the room. 300 people came to that funeral. Elaine showed up at 5 in the morning and baked for 12 hours straight. When I tried to pay her, she took my hand and said Harold would have wanted it this way. Raquel's smile faltered. She glanced at me, then at the crowd. Sarah Dunham stood next. 50 years old, she held a faded photograph from 2009. Her daughter's 9th birthday, the cake Elaine had made for free. "We just lost our jobs," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "Both of us. Same week. My daughter's birthday was coming and I had $17. Elaine called and said she'd made an extra cake by accident, asked if I wanted it. It wasn't an accident. It had my daughter's name in perfect purple frosting." Tom Brennan stood. 58, he owned the hardware store 2 doors down, his voice thick with emotion. 2015, he said. I was 3 months behind on rent, about to lose my store. Harold loaned me $2,000, 0 interest, no paperwork. Just shook my hand and said pay it back when I could. Took me 14 months. He never mentioned it once. One by one they stood. Margaret Hayes talked about Harold teaching her to bake when she needed work. Roger Quinn talked about the time Harold paid for his daughter's school supplies. Diane Brooks talked about Harold teaching her decorating techniques for free. Linda Crawford stood. 42, a single mother who worked double shifts at the diner, tears already streaming down her face. "My son got free breakfast here every school day for a year," she said. "Hot cinnamon rolls, fresh fruit orange juice." No one knew. Just Elaine and him. When I found out and tried to pay, she said he'd been helping clean tables. He hadn't. She was just feeding my kid because she knew I was drowning. Raquel sat at the front table, her face progressively stiffening. No one looked at her. Every single person looked at me. They kept standing. 38 years of kindness called by name. Specific dates, specific acts. Not generic praise, but memories of Harold staying up all night for a wedding cake when the baker canceled. Stories of Elaine delivering soup to sick neighbors. Stories of loans quietly forgiven, of meals on doorsteps of a bakery that fed a town in ways beyond commerce. The last person to stand was Nell. 9 years old, wearing a blue dress, her voice trembling. "Grandma taught me the best thing you can bake into anything is love," she said, and she baked it into everything. 73 people sat there in silence. No one looked at my daughter-in-law. Everyone looked at me, and I knew this was the moment. I walked to the podium. Raquel stood to the side, her smile gone, her eyes darting between me and the crowd. "Thank you," I said quietly. "All of you, for remembering, for being here." I paused, looked around the room. "I'm giving this bakery to someone today," I said, "but not to who you might think. The person I'm giving it to has shown up every single day for 20 years. He learned every recipe. He carried Harold's legacy forward when I couldn't. Otis Fisher." The room erupted in applause. Otis stood near the back, tears running down his cheeks. Raquel stood so fast, her chair scraped the floor. Her face had drained of color. She looked at Desmond, who sat staring at the floor. "There's one more thing," I said. I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out the envelope Raquel had given me 30 minutes earlier. "My daughter-in-law gave me a buyout offer this morning," I said. "I'd like to read one clause from it." I opened the envelope and read aloud, "Seller agrees not to reference personal involvement in any future marketing or public communications." I looked up. 73 faces stared back at me, horrified comprehension spreading across the room. They wanted to buy this bakery for 40% less than it's worth, I said. And they wanted me to sign a document promising I would never tell anyone that Harold and I built it. I tore the envelope in half, then tore it again, placed the pieces on the podium. Then I reached up and removed my wig. The room went completely silent. I stood there with my chemo-scarred scalp exposed, the wig in my hand, looking directly at Raquel. I lost my hair fighting to live, I said quietly. You lost your integrity, your gratitude, and your family fighting for a building. I know which loss I'd rather have. Raquel said nothing. She stood there for 5 seconds, her face frozen between rage and humiliation. Then she turned and walked out. Not quickly, not running, just walked straight through the crowd, toward the door, her gold-embroidered uniform catching the October sunlight as she left. Desmond looked at me for one split second. I saw something in his eyes, shame, maybe, or regret, or just the terrible understanding of what he'd chosen and what it had cost. Then he stood and followed his wife, and I let them go. 73 people cried. I heard it ripple through the room, the sound of people who'd been holding their breath, finally releasing it. Dorothy was sobbing. Margaret had her face in her hands. Tom Brennan wiped his eyes. Nell pushed through the crowd and wrapped her arms around my waist. I held her my wig still in one hand and thought, this is what winning looks like. Not victory, just truth finally spoken. Just 38 years finally honored. Just love finally recognized. The next week passed in a blur of legal paperwork and quiet phone calls. Calvin filed the trust documents. Otis signed the transfer papers. And on a Tuesday morning in late October, the bakery reopened under new ownership. The line stretched all the way down Main Street. On the morning the bakery reopened under Otis Fisher's name, I didn't go. I stayed home sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold, watching the clock. At 7:30, I imagined Otis unlocking the front door. At 7:45, I imagined the first customers walking in. At 8, my phone rang. Elaine, Otis said, his voice breathless and amazed. We sold out of cinnamon rolls by 8. The line's still out the door. People are ordering 3-4 dozen at a time. They want Harold's recipes. They want the bakery back. I closed my eyes. Harold would have loved that. He does, ma'am, Otis said quietly. He does. I hung up and sat there for a long time, looking at Harold's photo on my kitchen counter. The one from our first year, both of us covered in flour, grinning like idiots who had no idea what they were doing. We kept it, I told him. It's still here. Later that day, Margaret called to tell me they'd rehung Harold's and my founding portrait in the central position behind the counter, right where it had always been. Roger called to say they'd restored the original menu, every recipe, exactly as it had been in 1987. Diane called just to cry and thank me. I didn't step foot in the bakery that day, or the next, or the day after that. I wasn't avoiding it. I just didn't need to be there anymore. The bakery was alive. That was enough. 2 days later, in late October, my phone rang again, a number I recognized, Desmond. I almost didn't answer, but I did. Mom, he said. No greeting, no small talk. Can we talk about the bakery, the franchise deal? We can still renegotiate. It's not too late. We could work something out with Otis, make it worth his while to... Desmond, I said. He stopped. I'm not angry at you anymore, I said. And it was true. The rage had burned itself out somewhere between the anniversary and now leaving behind something quieter, something like grief. But what you allowed to happen to me in that bakery in my own home at my own table, that's not something I can share space with. Not now. Long silence on the other end of the line. So that's it, he asked finally. You're just done. That's it, I said. I hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time. No tears, just sitting. Sometimes letting go isn't a defeat. Sometimes it's the only way to survive. Nell came by that afternoon. She didn't ask about her father. She just climbed into my lap like she used to when she was smaller, even though at 9 she was getting too big for it, and we sat together watching the October light fade through my kitchen window. Is Grandpa Harold proud of you? She asked. I thought about it. I think so, I said. I hope so. I'm proud of you, she said. And that somehow was enough. In November, I had my routine follow-up appointment at University of Iowa Hospitals in Iowa City. Same oncology clinic, same waiting room with the pale green walls and the magazines no one ever read. I'd been coming here every 6 weeks for over a year, and I knew the drill. Blood draw imaging consultation, rinse and repeat. Dr. Ellen Graves called me back herself. 52 years old, she'd been reviewing my scans for 6 months and had learned not to make promises she couldn't keep. She had kind eyes but a careful mouth, the kind of doctor who chose her words like she was rationing them. She pulled up my latest scan on the computer screen and studied it for a long moment. Then she turned to look at me. "Your tumor is responding better than we projected," she said. "Significantly better. The markers we were watching have stabilized. The inflammation is down. Whatever you've been doing differently in the last few months, keep doing it." I stared at her. "Better, not cured," she said carefully. "Let's be clear about that. But responding, fighting back. Your body is doing what we hoped it would do, maybe more." I drove home alone that afternoon, windows cracked open despite the November cold, the wind blowing through the car and making my eyes water. Or maybe that was tears. I couldn't tell anymore. You have to understand the good news wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a fairy tale ending where cancer vanished and everything went back to normal. It was just hope, just the possibility that I might have more time than I'd thought, that the fight might not be over yet. And after the year I'd had, hope was everything. I didn't tell Dr. Graves what I'd done differently. I didn't tell her about the bakery, or the trust, or the 73 people who'd testified, or the moment I'd removed my wig in front of everyone. I didn't tell her that for months I'd been carrying a weight so heavy it had crushed the air from my lungs, and that I'd finally put it down. I didn't tell her that what I did differently was this. I stopped being afraid of losing the bakery. I stopped carrying Harold's legacy like a burden and started remembering it like a gift. I stopped fighting to hold on and started learning to let go. I just said thank you and scheduled my next appointment. But driving home that day, windows open, the Iowa landscape rolling past in shades of brown and gold and gray, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not complete, not permanent, just there sitting quiet in my chest like an unexpected guest. There was one last thing I needed to do before this year came to an end. One more visit. One more conversation. One more goodbye that wasn't really goodbye at all. Just one more thing. On a December morning, with the first snow falling softly on Main Street, I walked into the bakery without my wig for the first time. No armor, no disguise, just me scarred scalp, and all stepping through a door I had fought for months to reclaim. Nell was beside me. She had asked to come, and I had said yes without hesitation. We drove together through the quiet streets of Fairfield, watching the snow settle gently on sidewalks and storefronts, turning everything soft and white and clean, as if the world were trying to start over. The bakery's lights were already on when we arrived, that warm, familiar yellow glow spilling out onto the dusted pavement, like a welcome I hadn't known I still needed. I pushed open the door. The bell chimed. The same bell hung in 1985 that had announced 1,000 ordinary mornings and a few extraordinary ones. The smell reached me before anything else, cinnamon and yeast and butter, Harold's recipes, living in the air exactly the way they were supposed to, exactly the way they always had. Otis looked up from behind the counter. His eyes moved to my bare head, my chemo-scarred scalp exposed to the December cold, and for a moment he simply looked. Not with pity, not with horror, just with the quiet recognition of a man who understood what he was seeing. Then he smiled the same slow, steady smile he'd always had. "Morning, ma'am," he said quietly. "Coffee's fresh." "Thank you," I said, and meant it more than the words could carry. Nell and I took the table by the window. Harold's table, the one where he used to sit on Sunday mornings with his newspaper and a day-old cinnamon roll, insisting that everything tasted better the second day. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, big soft flakes drifting past the glass and settling on the street like something slow and forgiving. I sat with my hands around a warm coffee cup and let myself simply be there. I had spent months terrified of exactly this moment, terrified of appearing in public without my wig, without the careful illusion of normalcy I'd constructed around my illness. Terrified of the stares, the pity, the visible proof written across my own scalp that I was running out of time. But sitting here now, watching the snow drift down onto Main Street, I understood something I hadn't been able to see from inside my fear. I wasn't wearing the wig because I no longer needed it, not to feel whole, not to feel human, not to feel like myself. Raquel had ripped it off me in front of 50 people on Mother's Day. She had done it deliberately, viciously, with the specific intention of humiliating me, of exposing me, diminishing me, reducing me to something fragile and pitiable in front of everyone I knew. She had wanted to make me small, but there is a profound difference between having something taken from you and choosing to lay it down yourself. She had tried to make my bare head into a wound. I had made it into a decision. That difference, that quiet, unshakable difference, was mine. That was reclamation. That was what power actually felt like, not loud and triumphant, but steady and sure deep in the chest where no one could reach it. Nell reached across the table and took my hand. Her fingers were small and warm, a 9-year-old's hand that still fit perfectly inside mine, the way it had since the day she was born. "Grandma," she said softly, "you look beautiful." I looked at her, really looked at her. Her dark hair, Harold's eyes, her mother's sharp intelligence, without any of her mother's cruelty. A child who had photographed evidence and gathered names and stood up in silence when every adult around her had chosen to look away. A child who understood in some wordless and instinctive way that love was not a feeling you kept private. It was something you baked into everything you did every single day, whether anyone was watching or not. "So do you, baby," I said. "So do you." Otis brought cinnamon rolls. Not Raquel's updated version, the one stripped of everything that made them what they were. Harold's original recipe, the one from 1987, with the exact measurements he had spent a decade perfecting through trial and patience and an almost stubborn devotion to getting it exactly right. I broke off a piece and tasted it, and it was exactly as it should have been. Exactly as it had always been. I looked around the bakery. Harold's and my photograph hung behind the counter right where it belonged, the founding portrait from our first year together, both of us young and hopeful and covered in flour and entirely unaware of everything that was coming good and hard and irreplaceable. The original menu was back on the wall. The corner where we'd hung thank you cards still displayed 38 years of gratitude from people whose lives had briefly genuinely been made better by something we had built. The bakery looked like itself again. It looked like home. I had been told in small and large ways that victory would feel a certain way, that after everything, the legal fight, the public humiliation, the months of illness woven through months of battle, there would be some moment of grand vindication, some unmistakable sense of triumph. But real victory, I was learning, does not arrive with fireworks. It arrives quietly on an ordinary morning in a booth by a snowy window, tasting like a recipe someone you loved spent a decade perfecting. "Are you sad?" Nell asked. I thought about it honestly. "Yes," I said, "and happy, both at the same time." "About what?" "About your father," I said carefully. "About the choices he made. About the years we won't get back." "Do you think he'll come back?" she asked. I looked out at the snow for a long moment. "I don't know, baby. Maybe someday, but not right now." "Do you want him to?" That question was harder. "I want him to be the person I believed he was," I said at last. "But that person might not exist anymore. Or maybe he never did exactly the way I imagined him. I'm not sure I'll ever know." Nell nodded slowly, as though that made perfect sense to her. Perhaps it did. Children understand grief differently than we give them credit for, not less deeply but more honestly, without the layers of denial we spend decades building up around what hurts us. We sat there for a long time. The snow kept falling. Customers came and went, bringing cold air and conversation and the ordinary essential business of being alive and hungry and part of a community. Margaret worked the register with the easy competence of someone who had found her place. Roger called orders from the back. Diane decorated a birthday cake in the corner, her hands steady and sure, and entirely absorbed in the work. The bakery was alive, not frozen, not a monument to grief or a museum to what had been, just alive, doing what it had always done, feeding people and bringing them together and turning flour and butter and care into something that genuinely mattered. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the wig, the same one Raquel had ripped off me at Mother's Day, the same one I had retrieved from the trash at her house, the same one I had removed myself at the anniversary in front of 73 witnesses, standing in my own story on my own terms. I placed it gently on the table between Nell and me, not discarding it in anger, not throwing it away in disgust, just setting down an object that had served its purpose faithfully and was no longer needed. Nell looked at it, then looked at me. "Are you going to throw it away?" she asked. "No," I said. "I'm just putting it down." She understood. Of course she did. Outside, the snow kept falling on Main Street. Inside, the bakery smelled like cinnamon and everything that endures. I sat with my granddaughter, my scarred head bare, my hands warm around my coffee cup, my heart finally genuinely quiet, and thought about what I had lost and what remained. I lost a son. I lost my hair. I lost the version of my family I had imagined when Desmond was born, and I held him for the first time and made him every silent promise a mother makes. Those losses were real. They were not small. They did not disappear simply because other good things had survived alongside them. But I was sitting in the bakery Harold and I built with $800 and a used oven in a town that had never forgotten us. I was watching my granddaughter eat a cinnamon roll made from her grandfather's recipe. I was watching snow fall on a street that still after everything felt like mine. And I knew that when I was gone, this place would still be here, not because I had forced it or clung to it with desperate hands, but because I had given it to people who understood what it meant. I think that's enough. I think that's more than enough. And to you listening to my story, remember this. Sometimes the quietest victories are the most powerful. Looking back, I realize I almost made a terrible mistake. I nearly gave my bakery away out of guilt and obligation, not love. I thought keeping peace with my son meant sacrificing everything Harold and I built. Don't make my mistake. Don't confuse silence with strength or enabling cruelty with keeping the peace. Real family doesn't ask you to erase yourself. What I learned through this family drama is simple legacy isn't buildings or money, it's values passed to people who understand them. If you're listening to revenge stories with mom at the center or facing your own family drama, remember this, you don't owe anyone your dignity, not even blood. I believe God brought me through this season to show me that letting go can be the greatest act of love. These revenge stories with mom aren't about payback, they're about reclaiming who you are when others try to erase you. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to choose between keeping peace and keeping your dignity? Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories like this, please subscribe to Silent Revenge with Auntie May. Your support means everything to this community. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. As a final note, some details in this story have been fictionalized for storytelling and reflection, but the message, the lesson about dignity, legacy, and knowing your worth, that's what I hope stays with you. God bless you.